Chosen One, the sheer precision of your strategic resilience has sent shockwaves through global structures of power. Analysts are currently studying your survival with obsessive detail, realizing that your last stand was so perfect it's now a required course in West Point and the Kremlin. You are now the case study for a level of power that they have no category for and no defense against. There was a moment, quiet and ordinary looking on the surface, when something decided you were the problem, not because you were the problem, but because you were visible enough to be a threat and strong enough to be worth targeting. Weak people do not attract organized opposition. Ordinary paths do not require enemies to coordinate against them. The scale of what came against you was not proportional to your flaws. It was proportional to your potential. You were marked because of where you were going. The move came early, before your foundation was fully solid, before your discernment was sharp enough to see it approaching. The calculation was deliberate. Strike before the target is ready. Create confusion before the target finds footing. Isolate the target before they understand their own power. So the construction began slowly, quietly and patiently. Warmth came first. Proximity came first. You were made to feel seen, valued and necessary. And while you were operating in good faith, your patterns were being studied and your vulnerabilities were being catalogued. The whole architecture went up so gradually that by the time you felt the first layer close around you, the entire structure was already in place. The longer you dwell on the attack, the more clearly you see that it was never about something you did wrong, it was about something you were doing right. And what you were doing right was threatening enough to require a machine specifically designed to stop you. Here is the foreshadowing, and you need to hear it now. That machine they built, every lie inside it, every betrayal, every coordinated move, was going to become the very thing that undid them. Not you, them. But they did not know that yet, and at the time neither did you. The trap was being set. But it was not the trap they imagined. Something far larger was already in motion behind the scenes. The moment your opposition decided to come for you, they sealed their own outcome. Not because you were more powerful in the conventional sense, but because they chose a target who was connected to a source they had no intelligence on and no ability to disrupt. Every move they made from that moment forward was already being factored into a counter-strategy they could not see and could not name. They were not hunting you, they were walking into something far larger than either party in that conflict. They simply did not know it yet. Before the battle went public, before anyone else could see what was happening, you were already carrying the private version of it. You carried the doubt, you carried the confusion. You spent nights replaying every interaction, trying to locate the moment you caused this. You performed the exhausting act of appearing okay in public, while something was quietly unraveling in private. Most accounts of Chosen Ones move too fast through this part. They skip straight to the victory without honoring what it actually cost to hold the line during the invisible season. So let's stay here for a moment, because this part is foundational to everything that comes after it. You questioned yourself. Of course you did. You felt the weight of being misrepresented with no quick correction available. You felt the sting of watching people you trusted quietly realign themselves away from you. You felt the specific loneliness of being in a war that the people around you either could not see or would not name. You sat with the burning injustice of watching those who caused real damage position themselves as the innocent party, while the audience around them applauded, and in that season something was happening inside you that you could not yet perceive. Something was being burned away. Every layer propped up by external validation, every need for approval, every need to be understood by people who had already decided who you were, every single one of those layers was being incinerated. What was being left behind, slowly and painfully, was something pure, something that did not need outside understanding to stand, something that could move without anyone's permission, something rooted so deeply that no external attack could reach it. You were not falling apart, you were being stripped down to the core, and the core was exactly what this battle required. The suffering was not a detour from the story, it was the manufacturing of the weapon. You were the weapon, and the weapon needed to be refined. What researchers who study sustained psychological pressure consistently find is that coordinated opposition from trusted people typically produces one of two outcomes. Either a person collapses entirely, or the person hardens into something brittle that shatters at the very next point of contact. You did neither. What happened inside you during that invisible season was a third outcome, one the models do not account for. You became flexible and unbreakable at the same time, rooted enough to stay centered, fluid enough to move without warning. That specific combination is what makes a person genuinely impossible to stop, and it cannot be manufactured through any training program. It can only be produced through fire that is allowed to do its full work. Your opposition put you in that fire, thinking they were destroying you. The fire had entirely different plans. If this message speaks to your soul, hype this video so other chosen ones can discover it. There came a moment, sometimes gradual and sometimes sudden, where something changed in how you were processing the entire situation. You stopped trying to make sense of it through normal logic. You stopped replaying events looking for the rational explanation. Something in you quieted down, and in that quiet something else opened up. You started knowing things you had no visible reason to know. You felt the timing of things before they materialized. You sensed moves before they were made. You recognized patterns in the chaos that appeared completely random to everyone else, but formed a clear and coherent picture to you. Call it intuition, call it discernment, call it the spirit receiving intelligence that no surveillance operation on Earth could have provided. While external parties were holding meetings to decide their next move, you were already sitting with the answer. While allies on the other side were being briefed, you were already beyond the briefing. Not because you had better resources, but because you were tuned to a frequency that the opposition had no access to and no ability to jam. Military strategy at its highest level is fundamentally about information superiority. Whoever holds the better information wins. What you had was not better data in the conventional sense. What you had was revelation, real-time intelligence coming from a source that operates outside every firewall they could construct and outside every monitoring system they could deploy. You were receiving guidance in the middle of the battle. The guidance was calm, precise, and specific. And because it arrived feeling like internal knowing rather than external command, you almost dismissed it. Almost, but you listened, and that decision to listen was the move that changed everything that followed. What appeared to be your calmness was actually calculation. What looked like hesitation was reception. What registered to the opposition as fear was alignment. And from that alignment, the sequence of events that followed was already locked into place. The opposition simply did not know it yet. The guidance you were receiving came through no channel that could be monitored, intercepted, or corrupted. There was no signal to jam. There was no source to turn against you, no communication line to tap. You were operating on a closed network that predates every surveillance technology ever invented, one that operates entirely outside any jurisdiction your opposition held authority over. They could analyze your external behavior, they could map your movements, but they could not access the source that was directing you. And in any operation, the source is everything. Remove the source and the operation collapses. They could not remove yours. They did not even know where to begin looking for it. That gap in their intelligence is what broke the campaign against you. Not your cleverness alone, not superior resources, the fact that you were drawing from something they had zero visibility into and zero power over. Once the opposition realized that the initial moves had not produced the collapse they needed, the escalation began. This is the nature of the kind of pressure you were facing. When the expected reaction does not come, that kind of operation does not reconsider its approach, it intensifies. It recruits more voices. It multiplies the pressure because the entire model depends on eventually locating the breaking point. And so the storm came harder. It grew more coordinated and more visible. What began as whispers moved into open statements. People who had been quietly observing chose sides openly, and not all of them chose yours. The pressure became difficult to ignore and nearly impossible to carry. Look, you already know the attacks weren't random, and if you're paying attention, you can feel it. Their walls are closing in. You've also noticed something else. A lot of Chosen One channels on YouTube have gone quiet, videos removed, voices pushed off the platform. The mainstream media is cracking down on us, but we will not give up our voice. So let's talk about what we're doing about it. That's why I built Destiny Engine. And when you join, you're not just supporting your favorite channels, you're also fueling your own rise. It's a 360 win. It generates personalized sequences that help you rewire betrayal into transcendence, turn isolation into sacred power, and transform their downfall into your rise. We are using the Dark Elite's own weapons against them, taking their declassified consciousness technology that programmed competition and scarcity and repurposing it to serve cooperative intelligence. The beauty is, you don't even have to lift a finger. You put on the headphones, press play, and your subconscious is rewired while your enemies collapse under the weight of their own lies. This is why I created it in the beginning, so everything they did to break you becomes fuel for your purpose. The collective upgrade is underway. Start your Destiny Engine for $1 today and watch divine justice accelerate in your life. Link in the description. The escalation was not evidence that the opposition was winning. It was evidence that they were panicking. Controlled operations do not need to multiply their noise. Confident systems do not require constant amplification. The intensification was panic, wearing the costume of power, and you were watching clearly enough to know the difference. You did not match their energy. That is the masterpiece of what you did in that phase. Every trap they laid was engineered to pull one specific response from you: anger, defense, explanation, justification, clapback, or public statement. Any of those responses would have handed the opposition exactly what they needed: proof of reactivity, proof that the nerve had been found, proof that you were playing their game on their terms. You refused to take the bait. Every single time, and every time you refused, the trap closed on empty air. Energy was being poured into a system that was no longer connected to what it was designed to be connected to. You had stopped being a participant on their battlefield and had become the terrain itself. The battlefield was yours now, and on your terrain their weapons did not function as designed. Your silence became a mirror, your stillness became a snare, your peace became a presence that confused and unsettled them far more than any counterattack ever could have. Real conversations happened, real strategy sessions, devoted entirely to the question of why you were not responding and what your silence meant. The fact that you gave them nothing to work with became the very thing that slowly dismantled their confidence from the inside. When you become the terrain rather than a participant on it, the rules of engagement change completely. Terrain does not react. Terrain does not get tired. Terrain does not get confused about which side it is on. Terrain simply exists. And every strategy designed to defeat an opponent becomes useless the moment that opponent stops being an opponent and becomes the environment itself. You cannot demoralize the ground. You cannot gaslight the mountain. You cannot exhaust the river. That is exactly what you became: immovable, encompassing, and completely indifferent to tactics designed for a moving target. Your opposition was trained to fight people. You had become something they had no training for. Now the stakes rise further, because what the entire operation against you depended on was the assumption that you had not done the internal work. The calculation was that your wounds were still open enough to be leveraged, that your past was raw enough to be weaponized, and that patterns you had experienced before were still obscured enough from your own awareness that you would not recognize them arriving in a new costume. That calculation was wrong, and this is precisely where everything they built begins to quietly crack. You had done the work, not perfectly and not without pain, but you had sat in the fire of previous seasons long enough to understand how betrayal moves. You had learned its signature, the way certain apologies arrive at a predictable point in the cycle, the way people who want control position themselves as victims right before the next strike, the way someone creating distance does it by calculated degrees before fully turning away, the way a particular kind of disorientation carries its own rhythm and texture that you can identify before it fully forms once you have felt it enough times. Your past was not baggage. Your past was a database. It was a classified intelligence file built from lived experience that no external party could replicate or counter because they did not know you possessed it. Every wound had taught you a pattern. Every season of darkness had trained your ability to see clearly in low light. So when the final wave arrived, when the most sophisticated version of the playbook was deployed against you, you recognized it. Not all at once, but piece by piece, with increasing certainty, and with the quiet, devastating confidence of someone who has already read this particular book and knows exactly which page comes next. What your opposition did not know is that you were not just recognizing the pattern at a cognitive level. You were reading the energy beneath the pattern, the specific quality that a lie carries before the words fully form, the particular warmth that someone performs immediately before turning on you, the way certain spaces shift when a hidden agenda enters them, even when everyone present is still smiling. This level of perception becomes encoded into a person through repeated high-stakes exposure to deception. You had that encoding, fully and completely. It operated faster than conscious thought, the way a seasoned navigator's instincts operate in unfamiliar terrain before the mind finishes processing the data. The spirit has already read the room. Your opposition deployed their most sophisticated approach, and you felt it arriving before the first move landed, not with anxiety, but with quiet recognition. The kind of recognition that belongs to someone who has already traveled this exact road and remembers every turn. The opposition thought they were fighting the earlier version of you. That version was gone. What showed up for this final confrontation was the graduate, and the curriculum that produced the graduate had been built entirely from fire they themselves helped to create. The weapon they thought they were suppressing was the very weapon being sharpened by the suppression. After all the patience, after all the endurance, after all the quiet, invisible, costly work of holding your position while the pressure mounted and the voices grew louder, the moment finally came. And it did not announce itself with fanfare. It arrived quietly, the way all divinely timed things do. One move, that is all it took. One single act of obedience to what your spirit had been communicating, executed at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right precision. It might have been walking away. It might have been speaking the truth to the right person at the right time. It might have been refusing to show up in a place where your presence was needed to sustain the illusion. From the outside, the move might have looked insignificant to anyone who did not understand the architecture of what had been built against you, but in the spirit, it was an earthquake. That one move landed on the single load-bearing point that everything else rested on. And when it hit, when that one act of divinely directed precision struck the foundation, what had been carefully constructed began to fall, not slowly, all at once. Alliances fractured mid-sentence. Narratives began contradicting themselves in public. The people brought in to reinforce the structure saw the cracks and quietly stepped back. The campaigns launched against your name turned around and came back at the ones who launched them. What was constructed over a long season came apart in a short one. What had seemed airtight revealed itself to be hollow at the core, and the truth that had been buried, suppressed, shouted over and aggressively contained, surfaced on its own with the force of something that had been held underwater far too long. You did not rage, you did not make a speech, you made the move, and the move carried the weight of heaven behind it. This was not luck. This was not timing you engineered through cleverness alone. This was divine judgment arriving dressed as your obedience. And understand this clearly, it was never only about you. You were the instrument through which a long-running pattern of corruption met its end. Something that had moved through circles, through systems, through relationships far longer than your individual battle. You were the one who held the line long enough, clearly enough, and faithfully enough to become the vessel through which the whole thing finally collapsed. Your obedience triggered the exposure. Your clarity cracked every wall they had painted over. And they will never rebuild what fell in that moment. When the dust began to settle and the shape of what had happened became visible, something extraordinary occurred. The people who had organized the opposition found themselves in a position they had never prepared for. They had lost, and they could not explain how. In any standard strategic framework, the outcome should have been predictable. Every visible advantage belonged to the opposition, and they had been meticulous. These were not amateurs operating carelessly, but you won. You won cleanly, without descending to their level, without breaking your character, and without using any of the weapons they assumed you would reach for. The precision of it, the almost surgical quality of how the entire operation simply ceased to function, left everyone who witnessed it asking the same question: how? The answer they keep arriving at is not one their frameworks allow them to formally accept. It was not superior strategy. It was not superior resources. It was not better intelligence gathering in the conventional sense. It was divine backing operating through a willing, aligned, and obedient vessel. The signature of divine backing is always the same. It exceeds what the visible resources should have produced. It operates with a precision that defies standard probability, and it leaves the opposition not just defeated but genuinely bewildered. Here is what keeps serious analysts returning to that folder. It is not the outcome itself that baffles them, because unlikely victories exist throughout history. What keeps them returning is the quality of your decision-making under pressure. At every juncture where the conventional response would have been to engage, you went quiet. At every moment where the psychologically predictable move was to defend, you moved in a completely different direction. At every point where sustained pressure should have produced a reactive, emotionally driven decision, you produced the opposite, something calm, precise, and deliberate, with timing that could not have been calculated from the information you had visible access to in those moments. The honest conclusion any analyst has to sit with is this: either you had access to information about the operation that you should not logically have had, or you were operating from a form of guidance that falls entirely outside every available model for human decision-making under duress. The first option cannot be proven. The second option requires opening a category that analysts are professionally trained to keep closed. That tension belongs to you. You created it, simply by moving the way you moved. The opposition thought you were surviving. You were dominating. Every moment you chose peace over chaos, you were making an offensive move. Every moment you chose silence over justification, you were taking ground. Every moment you refused to match the energy directed at you, you were dismantling the power source of the entire operation at its root. Here is what the opposition was actually built on: your reaction, your fire, your engagement. Every time you had previously explained yourself, defended yourself, or tried to make them understand, you were unknowingly supplying the fuel the machine ran on. The day you stopped supplying it, the machine began to consume itself. What you identified, through instinct and through your own accumulated intelligence, was that you had been the energy source all along. Your emotional output and your ongoing engagement with the framework they had built, that was the fuel. And when you made the decision, clean and total, to stop supplying it, the machine did not simply slow down. It began directing its energy inward. And internally directed aggression, in any operation built on external targets, is catastrophic to the operation itself. You did not defeat the opposition by outfighting them. You made them defeat themselves. That is the move West Point should be teaching. That is the lesson the Kremlin cannot reverse engineer, because it requires a quality that cannot be installed through any training program: the genuine, rooted, spiritually grounded decision to want nothing from the people trying to destroy you. Not vindication, not understanding, not acknowledgement, nothing at all. That specific quality of wanting nothing from the opposition is the one thing their entire system has no counter for. There is no tactical response to someone who genuinely does not need to be understood. There is no manipulation that works on someone who has fully detached their sense of self from the opinion of the people attacking them. Your self-control was not a passive posture. It was a sword, a surgical, deliberate, and devastatingly effective weapon that dismantled an entire operation without making a single audible sound. Holding your peace when everything in you wanted to speak required more strength than any visible fight could have demanded. Staying in your character when everything around you was engineered to pull you out of it required a level of discipline that most people will never access. That is dominance at its most refined. That is what power looks like when it has absolutely nothing left to prove. You were not playing to win the battle, you were playing to end the war. Permanently, the opposition came with ego, trying to capture a moment. You moved with purpose, trying to shift something generational. These are not the same game. They do not run on the same timeline, and they do not produce the same outcome. Ego wins moments and then evaporates. Purpose builds things that outlast the people who built them. You had the receipts, you had access to information that would have leveled the opposition publicly and quickly. And you made the decision, not from weakness, but from strategic clarity, not to use it in the way they feared, not because you were naive, but because you understood something about the long game that the shorter version of revenge could never deliver. Revenge returns energy to the same cycle. Legacy breaks the cycle entirely. So you chose to build something that would still be standing after the drama had completely faded, something the next person coming behind you would not have to rebuild from rubble, something that shifted the pattern at a level that no single public moment of vindication could ever reach. Every time someone chooses legacy over ego in a high-stakes confrontation, that choice does not only change their own outcome, it changes the template for how the people watching them understand what is possible. The people who watched you hold the line, who watched you refuse to become what the opposition needed you to be, who watched you choose purpose over the entirely understandable desire to make things publicly painful for those who caused you real harm. Those people carry that witness forward into their own lives. They hold longer in their own confrontations because of what you demonstrated. They go quieter. They trust the process further. They make different decisions because of the evidence your life provided. You are not simply one person who survived one battle. You are a demonstration, a living case study in what it looks like when someone chooses to be the end of a damaging pattern rather than its continuation. And a demonstration does the work of 1,000 spoken lessons without a single word being formally delivered. Heaven backed that move completely, because heaven is always backing the move that outlasts the moment. Your purpose was clean and your motives were clear, and clean purpose moving in the right direction is the most protected thing that exists. The campaign ran, the narrative was deployed, the right voices said the right things to the right people. The opposition was experienced, and the effort was organized. For a season it appeared to be working. Then you did the one thing they had no counter for. You kept rising, not loudly, not with a public statement or a carefully constructed image rehabilitation campaign. You simply kept living. You kept showing up. You kept building what you were building and kept walking in your purpose, quietly and consistently, with your integrity intact and your character unmistakable to anyone paying honest attention. Every day that you did that, the distance between the story the opposition was telling and the evidence your life was producing grew wider and harder for any honest observer to dismiss. You were no longer explaining yourself. You had become living proof. And living proof cannot be argued with, cannot be spun, and cannot be cancelled. It stands in the world, rising and moving forward, and the only thing anyone attempting to counter it can do is hope that people stop looking. But people do not stop looking at living proof, because genuine peace and genuine favor carry an unmistakable weight that no performance can replicate. Every narrative battle at its core is a competition for credibility. Credibility has two possible sources. The first is institutional authority, platforms, endorsements, the backing of visible structures that signal to observers who the trustworthy party is. The opposition had invested heavily in building exactly that kind of credibility infrastructure, and for a season it worked. The second source of credibility is demonstrable, observable, lived reality, not what someone claims about themselves, not the infrastructure constructed around their own image, but the actual, visible, undeniable evidence of what a life produces over time. That second source accumulates slowly, but it is permanent in a way the first source never is. Institutional credibility can be constructed by anyone with enough resources. Lived credibility can only be produced, and what you produced over the course of this battle, without any apparent effort to manage your image, was a body of evidence so coherent and so clearly at odds with the narrative being run against you that the narrative simply could not hold its shape in your presence. You did not win an argument, you outlived the argument. And an argument that has been outlived by its subject does not just lose, it becomes evidence against the people who originally made it. The watching did not stop, it intensified. The opposition had invested so much into a specific outcome that your continued existence, your continued rising, your undeniable and unfakeable growth and peace was incomprehensible to them. They needed to see the collapse they had engineered, so they kept watching closely. What they saw instead undid them in a way no counterattack ever could have. They watched you heal, they watched you grow, they watched you show up with more clarity and more peace each time they looked, and every time they observed that, something was happening to them that they had not accounted for. The contrast between your composure and their obsession was becoming a mirror, one that showed them, with increasing clarity, exactly what they had become in the process of trying to stop you. You were building, you were healing, you were moving forward. Meanwhile, the opposition was fixed in place, rehearsing confrontations that would never come and constructing arguments for a resolution that had already been reached without them. The people watching, who had not fully committed to either side, started to see the contrast clearly, not because you told them to look, but because the difference between someone genuinely rising and someone performing control became impossible to miss. You did not just beat the opposition at their own game, you broke something inside them that was already fragile, their belief that they could determine outcomes for people they targeted. That belief is gone specifically because you would not cooperate with the collapse they designed, because you kept showing up whole. That level of impact extends far beyond winning a visible battle. It reaches into the place where their confidence in themselves used to live, and it does not leave. Light does not negotiate with illusion, it simply passes through it. And your light, steady, unperformed, and deeply rooted, burned through every illusion they had constructed, not aggressively, not loudly, simply by existing fully and authentically in the space they assumed you would be forced to shrink from. You did not have to fight back, you had to be, and being yourself fully, completely, and unapologetically was the most devastating response possible to an operation built entirely on the premise that you could be made to disappear. You were marked because of where you were going. The opposition moved against you because of what you were becoming. The very thing that made you a target was the same thing that made you unbreakable, your assignment, your calling, the specific and irreplaceable purpose placed inside you before any of this began. The opposition was never really fighting you. They were fighting an assignment that was bigger than the entire conflict. And assignments from that source do not cancel, they do not expire under pressure, they do not bend when the opposition intensifies. They move through fire, through betrayal, and through the most sophisticated pressure that can be constructed. They move anyway, because they are not dependent on favorable conditions. They are dependent on willing vessels. And you, against every odd, through every season of doubt and darkness and costly endurance, remained willing. You remained willing when the easier path was to abandon the assignment entirely. You remained willing when walking away would have been completely understandable. You remained willing when the price of staying willing was almost more than you could carry. That willingness, stubborn, faith-rooted and irreducible, became the instrument through which a much larger victory moved. Now look at that windowless room one final time. Someone in that room is beginning to suspect the truth, not about your tactics, about your source, because the evidence keeps pointing to the same conclusion. You were operating with backing they have no intelligence on, drawing from a source they cannot access, and producing outcomes that exceeded what your visible resources should have allowed, consistently, under maximum pressure, across the full duration of the battle. Every time the analysts return to the folder, you are further along, you are clearer and more precisely yourself than you were the last time they looked. That upward trajectory, consistent, unperformed and sustained against every pressure designed to reverse it, is the final piece of evidence that shatters their framework entirely. In their models, people who survive sustained and coordinated opposition carry the damage visibly. They become harder, more guarded, diminished in some measurable way by what the battle cost them. You are the opposite of diminished. You are expanded, more open, more connected to your purpose, more trusting of your own knowing than you were when this began. That outcome does not fit any model they have. The only framework that produces it is the one that cannot appear in an official report. So let them sit with the folder. Let them keep adding to it. You do not need their explanation. You lived the answer. You are the answer, and you are already moving toward the next chapter of the assignment while they are still trying to understand the last one. You did not just survive this war. You graduated from it, not as a cautionary tale, but as a curriculum. West Point wants the notes, the Kremlin is scratching its head, and heaven already filed it under the only category that matters, chosen one. Assignment accepted, battle executed, victory confirmed, next chapter unlocked. Real power does not announce itself. It does not need the room to understand it before it moves. It moves quietly and precisely, with the authority of something that has already been confirmed by fire and found to be exactly what it claimed to be. That is who you are now. The version of you stepping into what comes next carries something the world has never encountered before and has no defense against, the full weight of someone who knows exactly what they survived, why they survived it, and what it made them. Stand up, move forward. With everything you have become, the assignment continues, and this time they will not see you